Shalom and welcome to Torah in Orbit, Jewish Journey in Space. We are here in Boston with astronaut Hoffman, who is going to share with us his exciting journey in space, over 5 space missions and more. My personal Jewish journey as Israeli started with the Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon. Like many Israelis, and Lily, please show the slide. Like many Israelis, for us, like when Ilan Ramon came, it was such an honor for all of us to see an Israeli Jewish astronaut joining NASA and representing Israel. And Ilan Ramon also, when he did this, he was talking that he is representing the entire state of Israel, but also the entire Jewish nation. And not only the people present time, but also people from the past and also future generations. And Ilan Ramon also took with him a very special Torah that had passed in the Holocaust and survived a very moving story. And Tammy Lehman Wilzig, an Israeli author, actually wrote a beautiful children's book about this Torah. And in the next slide, we see a picture of this book, Ilan Ramon with his Torah. But in 2006, I actually had a very exciting opportunity to meet Hoffman. 2016. We met at Hebrew College, and Jeff was sharing his journey, his personal, professional, the Jewish journey, with our rabbinical students at Hebrew College, and also with our faculty. And I was surprised to hear about the richness of his Jewish journey. And since then, I'm trying to share the story with as many people as possible, including today through this live broadcast. And also, we're working together on a documentary film that will share the story and all the wonderful things and inspiring things that Jeff did over the years. But today, the presentation today, we're going to have the opportunity to hear from Jeff, but we're also going to include some time for a question in the end. And these are some links, some opportunities for you to ask questions. So please send them throughout this broadcast, and we'll try to answer as many of them in the last 10-15 minutes of this podcast. So I want to now turn to you, Jeff. And if you can share with us a little bit about your dream when you started to think about the star and being an astronaut.
Well, first I should mention, since you talked about Ilan Ramon, that I was fortunate enough to have met him when he was in the astronaut office in Houston. He spent quite a few years there because their flight continually kept getting delayed. And I have to say, many of the international astronauts kind of have difficulty, blending in and making a lot of friends in the astronaut office outside their own crew. But Ilan, everybody in the office knew him. It might have been because, of course, a lot of the astronauts are pilots, and Ilan was already a military hero in Israel, and the Israeli Air Force is very well respected among the American pilot community. So Ilan was a remarkable person, very wonderful, and I've met his wife on numerous occasions, both before and after the Columbia flight and the tragedy at the end of the flight. People should remember it was a very successful flight in terms of the scientific experiments that Ilan and his crewmates performed, and it was just so tragic at the end that Columbia, on which I flew twice actually, 2 of my 5 flights in space were on Columbia, and the loss of the crew. But let's turn to my history, and it's kind of a joke because I was born in Brooklyn Jewish Hospital in New York City, and I'm old enough that when I was a young boy, there were no real astronauts. So my childhood heroes were Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. That's on the next slide. Are you moving through?
Really move to, yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
So Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and then I also remember the first launch of Sputnik, and my dad used to take me to the Hayden Planetarium in New York City to see all the new shows. I was always fascinated by space. And so, of course, when Sputnik went up, we went out to the high school football field. We were living in the suburbs by then. And I remember watching it fly over. And then I remember when the very first humans started going into space, the early astronauts, the Mercury astronauts at NASA, and of course, Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. And I always thought to myself, God, wouldn't it be great to go into space just like Flash Gordon? But all of the early astronauts clearly were military test pilots, and that was not a profession for me. So my love of space and science drew me towards astronomy. And I was interested in what we call space-based astronomy, where we were looking at types of radiation like X-rays, which don't get through our atmosphere, luckily for us, of course. So we had to send our telescopes up, in this case on a sounding rocket, a lot smaller than what I was originally riding in, but already this is kind of our Dr. Strangeglove moment. You can see me right up at the front there. I had a beard and a cowboy hat. This was when I had already gotten my doctorate in astrophysics at Harvard University and was spending 3.5 years over in England. And that's where I met my wife. And our oldest son was born over there. And then I was offered a position at the Center for Space Research at MIT. So we came back after 3.5 years in England, and our son was 10 weeks old at the time. So at MIT, we were actually putting our telescopes, X-ray telescopes, into much larger satellites and launching them on much bigger rockets, which you can see in the next slide. And it was in the next slide, please. And there we go. So yeah, I saw this was an Atlas rocket, and we launched our big satellite on there. And still I was dreaming, wouldn't it be great someday to go into space? Well, in the next slide, you'll see one of the early tests of the Enterprise, which was the shuttle which was used to demonstrate flight in the atmosphere. And this was when, in the late 70s, when NASA was testing what was then, of course, the brand new Space Shuttle. And the thing about the Space Shuttle, it had a crew of 7, and they only needed 2 pilots, which really opened things up for scientists and engineers, medical doctors, and NASA realized they were going to need new astronauts, younger astronauts, to fly the shuttle. So I was lucky enough to get selected back in 1978 as one of 35 new guys, and we were the first US astronaut group with women. We had 6 women, including Sally Ride and Judy Resnick, another Jewish astronaut. So my life changed. You can see in a couple of pictures now, although I was not a military pilot, spaceflight is really an extension of high-performance jet aviation, and they wanted us to get experience there. You can also see, by the way, I had to shave my beard off because we wore oxygen masks flying these T-38s up at 45,000 feet, and oxygen masks don't seal well when you have a full beard. In any case, learned a lot, and it was sure a lot of fun, as you'll see in the next picture. Did all sorts. It's in addition to learning how to work with a crew in a complex mechanical system, which is potentially dangerous, you also learn to subject your body to unusual physiological circumstances, as you can see here, and also pulling a lot of G's. Well, that was pretty exciting, but I have to say, for any astronaut, of course, the first big exciting moment is when you get that call from Houston that, hey, you've just been selected, or do you still want to be an astronaut? And the second big exciting moment is when you get called in and told that you've just been assigned to your first crew. And this was my first crew, which originally we were going to fly in June of 1984. And back in those days, flights were often getting canceled and moved around. And in the end, after 4 different flight cancellations, we finally launched in April of 1985 A week before you launch, you go into a medical quarantine, and they feed us special food. They want to keep us healthy and not exposed to germs. So it turned out that this was just during the Jewish holiday of Passover. So I brought some matzah into crew quarters so that I could eat them. Well, the woman who was in charge of our food for the shuttle saw me eating these. She didn't know what matzahs were, so I not only did I offer to show her and let her taste one, but I asked if I could bring some on the shuttle. So she took one up and cracked off a piece. And of course, you all know when you crack matzah, crumbs fall all over the place. And she took one look at those crumbs and her eyes got big and she said, "No way is that going up on the shuttle." Because think about it, on the Earth, crumbs fall down to the floor and you can sweep them up or vacuum them. In space, crumbs just keep floating around and you can actually breathe them in. They're a health hazard. So we don't even normally take regular bread into space. It's because it has crumbs. What we use is tortillas, and they're unleavened, so I figured for Passover, what the heck. You can also, by the way, see Sandy's having a bad hair day there, which every day in space is a bad hair day.
But Jeff, you also mentioned that you flew, one of your flights was during Hanukkah. So maybe you can share with us a little bit. I know that I see here this like beautiful Sevivon that you took with you, and also a Chanukiah. Maybe you can share with us a little bit about these experiences.
Yeah, well, it actually started with my first flight. Although I didn't take the matzah on board, the rabbi at our synagogue had asked me if I wanted to take some Jewish ceremonial objects, and so I did. I took some mezuzot and the atarot, which eventually became part of the talisim for my two sons, which they wore on the bar mitzvahs, and we have some pictures of that later.
So maybe we can show it now, because the next slide is actually about the mezuzot. So you can talk about the mezuzot.
Sure.
And so Lily is helping us with the
yeah. So this is one of the mezuzot which I took. You can see a big picture there on the screen. The thing is, you have to make certain compromises in space. You can't nail it to the door of the shuttle. Think about it. A nice hole in the wall. So like so many things in space, we have to use Velcro. But I think it's the thought that counts and the symbolism behind it. And I continued to carry Jewish ceremonial objects on all of my flights, and even as far as my last flight, where this was a flight where we had 24-hour-a-day operations. So no, go back, please, to the bunk. And so half the crew had to be asleep while the other half was working. And so NASA provides these little isolated sleep bunks where you can slide the door closed. So I chose to put my mezuzah inside my bunk. But of course, you have to share the bunk with someone else. And I didn't want to bother anyone else with my mezuzah. So every morning I would take it down and put it in my pocket and carry it around. Then I'd put it up the night when I climbed in. Well, obviously one morning I forgot. And I must have left it in, because when the crew, the other shift, got up, and we all spent about an hour or so together in a handover, the astronaut who had slept in my bunk said, "Hey Jeff, that was a really nice move, carrying a mezuzah up there. Thanks." And I sort of realized, oh my goodness, that's Scott Horowitz. And of course, he's another Jewish astronaut, so he knew all about what a mezuzah was. So we left it in for the rest of the flight, and that was kind of nice. And then as part of this tradition, it turned out on my fourth space flight, and that's when we went up to fix the Hubble Space Telescope. And at this point, if you could go into the camera, Lily, because I had I took actually a dreidel with me, and the nice thing about being in space, can the people see the dreidel at this point? And we could actually spin it, and it would keep spinning essentially forever. And I also brought a little Chanukiah, which, you know, Judaism is a traveling religion, and you can open this up and put either little candles or oil and wicks inside. course, I couldn't light it up on the space shuttle. They don't. You don't really like open flames in a spacecraft. That wouldn't be too cool an idea. But it was the thought that counts. And I actually was showing my friends how the dreidel spun. This was after we finished our work up there, and Mission Control saw it and asked me what I was doing. So I gave a little chat about the holiday of Hanukkah, and a TV station in Los Angeles picked it up, and it's been on, now it's on YouTube, and you know, if you want to look up dreidel in space, you can see how we actually performed that little game up there, and what happens.
And we'll share it later on at the Global Day of Jewish Learning website, so everybody will be able to see that. And in the next slide, Jeff, I see that there is the atarot from the talitot that you took with you, and if I remember correctly, they're the atarot of the talitot of your sons that later on they use for their bar mitzvot, and later on for their wedding. But something that I noticed, it's not the regular blessing that sometimes we see on the talitot. There is a significance of this text.
Right. I wanted to choose something that had something to do both with space and space flight, and so for our oldest son, this atarot basically refers to Elijah ascending up into heaven in a fiery chariot. You can see Hashemayim at the end there, up into heaven. Maybe you can read the whole thing. And this is from the book of Kings, second book of King, and the second chapter. And you chose it appropriately because of space. I had a little help from my rabbi on that, but I have to say for our youngest son, whose name is Orin, which is an homage to my favorite constellation, Orion. I chose that myself. It was from the book of Job, the voice from the whirlwind, where
that's the next slide. The next slide that we can see on the wedding.
And actually, for his wedding, we took the talisim of both of our sons and used that on top of the huppah. And I don't know, that's pretty small, but maybe you can read it.
It's hard to read, but we are going to put it later on, maybe on the website.
Okay.
It would be interesting.
But it's basically when God, the voice out of the whirlwind, Job, of course, is complaining about his fate, and God basically tells him, you know, who do you think you are? Can you make the oceans go up and down, and can you move the stars of the Pleiades and Orion? I'm freely quoting here, but it's basically it's that astronomical reference with the constellation of Orion, which really drew me to it.
Yeah, and the next few slides, Jeff, we see you, I think, fixing the Hubble telescope.
Well, these were some of this was on my first space flight. I actually did the first time that NASA had ever sent astronauts out on an unplanned spacewalk. We had a satellite didn't work properly, and we had to make these tools and attach them to the robotic arm. And the next day we rendezvoused with the satellite and used it to flick a little switch on the outside. But it changed my life in a way, because obviously I guess I did a good job out there, because I became one of what they call a spacewalkers cadre. And when it was time to choose a crew to go up and rescue the Hubble Space Telescope, which some of our younger listeners may not remember, when it was put into space in 1990, it couldn't focus properly. They had made a mistake when they made the mirror, and it was a great disaster for NASA. But we were able to fix it, and I was fortunate enough to have been selected to be one of the 4 people who went out and did the spacewalks to repair the Hubble Space Telescope. And so both as an astronomer and an astronaut, I'd say that was one of the high points of my life, is putting my 2 hands on the greatest telescope out of this world, actually, and being able to bring it back to full readiness, where it has now become, these pictures from Hubble, what it's talked to us about the universe, told us about the universe, rewritten astronomical textbooks. a great source of pride when I think of what we were able to do. So that was my 4th space flight. And on my 5th space flight, the rabbi from our synagogue, for quite a while, several of my last flights, he said, you know, Jeff, you've brought all these Jewish ceremonial objects into space, but you know, the most important thing in Judaism is Torah. Couldn't you bring a Torah into space? Well, the thing is, we're only allowed to bring a certain number of small objects, and so I told him, you know, the Torah is too big. But he searched for a miniature, legible, fully kosher Torah. Finally found one from a scribe in New York, and with the help of the congregation, we brought it to Houston, and I brought it up, and I actually performed a ceremony of the very first reading of a Torah in space. I read the first words of the Bereshit, the first words of Genesis, because it was a beginning. One of the things that people often have asked me is, you know, what it meant to me. We often bring objects up into space and then we give them as souvenirs. It's kind of neat. People like the idea that, oh, I have a baseball cap that was up in space. That's neat. But I didn't really feel that way about the Torah, in the sense that, I mean, yes, it is a very special Torah because it was the first one that ever went into space. But to me, it's not that changed the Torah in any way. It changed space. It brought an element of holiness from human life, and we are human beings as astronauts, and we take our culture and our religions and with us when we travel, and it brought this holy aspect of human life, sacredness, into space, and made space, it humanized space in a sense.
You also share with me that you know, taking this ancient text to space.
Well, that's one of the things that from the very beginning, when I was taking these Jewish ceremonial objects, the idea that, you know, space flight it's the future. It's the most futuristic, high-tech activity that humanity has engaged in. And this is juxtaposed with a Jewish tradition of thousands of years ago. That always appealed to me, you know, the newest and one of the oldest traditions of humanity.
And that's for me, when I met you in 2016 as an educator, to see the value of bringing both together, especially that many times we speak about multiple identities that individuals have, and many times we keep them separately. We have our professional life, we have our Jewish life, we have other pieces, but here you brought through these 5 space missions, you brought them both together. And so I think that was so powerful about it, that's why also we want to share it, besides the fact that it was like very interesting and inspiring, but how can it inspire a next generation to really see themselves, the value of some of these ancient traditions in our text, the power of our text, that it's still relevant for us wherever we go, even if we go to space.
As I say, Judaism has always been a traveling religion, and we take it with us wherever we go.
Yeah. So before we continue, Jeff, I see that we have here on the table several other objects. I know this is a Kiddush cup. So how does it work to do a Kiddush in space?
Well, actually, first of all, NASA doesn't allow us to take wine. No alcohol on a U.S. spacecraft. But even suppose you wanted to do it with grape juice. Well, the problem is, you know, I could have a bottle of grape juice and I could turn it upside down and nothing would come out because gravity is not working on us up there. Everybody's floating. You're weightless. That's one of the great joys of being in space. It's a totally new physical environment. Your body has no weight. It's amazing. To drink anything that's liquid, you have to put it in a bag and suck it out with a straw. If you try, I mean, assuming that you could squirt some liquid into here, because we do have a little squirter with water, it would probably just go in and come right back out, and you know, bubbles of grape juice or whatever floating in the middle of the cabin. And we play with that sometime, you know, we push the drops around, but you got to be careful because you don't want it to get anything into your electronics.
And in this slide, we actually have You call it like a cue card? How do you?
There was a question of what kind of blessings I should say. We didn't have a minion, obviously, even though there was one other Jewish astronaut on board, although he was asleep normally when I was awake. So I worked with our rabbi to choose a few other select prayers. I mean, Judaism has a prayer for everything. Many of the things that we see up in space, thunderstorms and oceans and mountains, there are prayers for. And so one of the prayers, of course, was thankfulness for the gift of Torah, which is appropriate. And then another one was basically the praise of all of creation, which we have a very different perspective on, of course, when we look at the Earth, which is, as far as we know now, the home of life in our universe, and it becomes a very special place when you look at it from outside.
And the first blessing actually on this card is Tfilat HaDerech. And I see also that you have this like keychain of Tfilat HaDerech.
This was the blessings for a traveler.
Yeah.
And it was a gift to me from our congregation, and I read it with them on the final Shabbat before I had to leave and get ready for our space flight.
How did your congregation felt about all of this opportunity, this journey? What part did they take as part of your journey?
I think the most excitement was my last flight, because all the congregation knew about the Torah going into space. We had, there must have been 36 people from our congregation who came down to Florida to watch the launch, and I updated. We had a fax machine up. We could send messages down, and they could send messages up. So I did send a message after I had read from the Torah, just to let everybody know what had happened. And fortunately, it wasn't by luck. It was turned out very nicely that I was able to do this Friday night in Houston, which of course was Saturday morning in Jerusalem. So it was the right time all the way around for a Torah reading.
In which direction do you point when you're in space and reading Torah?
Out the window. So actually towards the TV camera. You're a little bit limited, and like so many things, you have to make certain compromises.
Yeah.
There is actually east, and there's no up and down in space, but there is east and west, and we go from west to east. So in principle, now that I think of it, we were moving towards the east, and our nose was pointing forward, and I was facing forward, so I was in fact facing east. But since we're going around the Earth every 90 minutes, some of the time Jerusalem was in front of me, and sometimes it was behind me. So what can you do? Yeah.
So, and also, how does it work? If every 90 minutes it change, you can't really celebrate. Like, how do you celebrate Shabbat or?
I'm sure the rabbis have an answer for that. There are other situations, like what do you do if you're above the Arctic Circle and the sun never sets, and sometimes in the year the sun never rises? I'm sure people have dealt with that in the past. As I say, from my point of view, we have a clock on the wall. I knew when it was Friday night in Houston and Saturday morning in Jerusalem. That was good enough for me.
Yeah. And that's what's very interesting about all of this, the adaptation over years. And Judaism over the years evolved a lot. So to see now, when we're talking about the new era of space travel, to think about it, what going to space will look like, and what are some of the adaptation that we need to do as we move forward with that. And I know we also have here the Samim box for Avdallah. Did you take anything inside, any spices?
No, NASA's pretty fussy about taking food and perishable items, so it had to fly empty.
So what do you do with this a Jewish object or other object that you take and you don't use? Do you store them somewhere?
Yeah,
what do you do with
basically we put it in a safe place, and they actually all of these are unwrapped, but I did bring another object just to show people how NASA takes very good care of them, and just to be sure that there's no bad chemicals or anything, they wrap them up. This is the Book of Psalms, which I took, and then they put a little identification tags. That's how you know that it actually did fly in space. So this is in its pristine condition.
Wow.
Never opened since it came back from space in 1996.
Wow, this is very exciting. So there's lots of adaptation over time, and it's nice to see all of the different artifacts. And I know that you mentioned that your congregation was sitting there when you went with the Torah. I know also that you had to detach the first piece of the Torah.
Well, even though the Torah was original, the Torah was miniature, and it was small enough that NASA was willing to put it in a safe place, packed away. Of course, I wanted to be able to read from it, and we're allowed even a smaller volume of things that we can take with us and have access to during the flight. And so the only way that I could really do that was to, we unsewed the first page of the parchment and made a special mini Torah out of it. Was actually, we started with a mini Torah and that became a micro Torah. It was the first page, but that's what we were reading from. And the rest of it was placed safely away. And then that's what I read from. And then when we got back, of course, it was properly rejoined. And actually, it was very nice. The scribe, rabbi from New York, who had originally brought the Torah over from Jerusalem, where it was first written, came to Houston and allowed everyone in the congregation to perform the mitzvah of finishing a Torah. He would take a little bit of a letter out and then guide our hand as we filled that in. So it was something that the whole congregation did together. It was a lovely ceremony. And then we had a special welcoming back ceremony for the Torah.
It was very nice. This week we actually met with Rabbi Shaul Osachi, that was your rabbi in Austin for many years. And he actually shared with us the process, how they selected this Torah. That there were several small Torahs in New York, and he asked for a fax of a page, and he asked little children, 7-year-old, that knew how to read the Hebrew, to see if they can identify some of the more tricky letters in Hebrew. So, for example, Daled and Resh and Bet and Chaf, and when they managed to read it correctly, he knew that this is the right Torah. And with the help of the congregant, they actually purchased the Torah. And the nice thing also that this Torah is not in a museum, it's still being used all the time by bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah girls and boys, and also people that can't carry a heavy Torah.
Yeah, and with a miniature Torah, everyone can be Hagban Galila.
Yes, so it's very nice. And a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to go and visit and see this Torah and read from it. So it's very nice to see it still living and impacting a new generation that are very excited about that. So this is excellent. And I know that some of the congregants also made like a cover, like a case.
Yep. And recently they added the 2 Torah ornaments are now little silver space shuttles, which is a very nice touch.
Yeah, the Rimonim that you can see later on the website. And as I said, that this is all part of the movie that we're making, how it's being used, the story of how it came to be, and all of this journey that went over all over this year, but still continue in some way. It didn't end in 1996 when he took the Torah and came back, but it still continued this journey. And I know, Jeff, that you prepared some other things for us to share today about the...
Well, I thought, in a lot of people like to ask, what does it feel like being in space? How does it make you feel? What does it have any lasting impact? And I sometimes, because it's so few people have been in space. I try to use analogies sometime. I love the mountains, for instance, and many times there is an analogy between mountaineering and spaceflight. Picture in the next picture of Matterhorn, one of my favorite mountains in Switzerland, which I've climbed actually 4 times, once with my father and my brother, once with a friend, and once with each of my 2 sons. Can we show the picture of the Matterhorn, please? The next slide. And the thing about mountaineering is, there's a certain danger involved, and it's hard work, effort to get up to the high regions. But once you're up there, there is this psychological transformation that you are removed from civilization down below, and somehow there's a clarity of your mind and a expansion of your horizon and your vision. And the point and the next slide, the idea is to understand that space is higher than the highest mountaintop. And so these feelings of being removed from civilization and a broader view and a clarity of thought are exaggerated. It's such a different perspective. Look at the picture of the sun up there. You have never seen the sun like this. And I don't mean the rays coming out of it. That's an artifact of the camera. But think about it. When you go out during the day and look up in the sky, you have always seen the sun in a blue sky. We see the stars in a black sky at night because there's not enough light to scatter off the atmosphere, but there's so much light from the sun that it scatters off the atmosphere and the blue light, and the sky is blue. Up in space, there's no atmosphere, so you see the sun as a real star. It's in a black sky. Of course, it's close to us, so it's bigger and brighter than any of the other stars, but it's an example of the totally different perspective. The two biggest things, the personal experience of spaceflight are first of all, what you see, which I try to share in photos, but what we feel, the weightlessness, the freedom of the human body. Again, we can only use analogies. And the next slide, you can actually see one of my crewmates was an amateur juggler. And he used to tell me that since time immemorial, the dream of jugglers has been to make it appear as though the balls you were juggling were just suspended in the air. Well, in space, you can do it. It's a different world. And the next slide that you can see is my magic carpet. It's not photoshopped. It's for real. I mean, it's almost a spiritual experience, the change in your body, like being in, it's like a new state of existence.
So how does it feel to come back?
Well, as we go through reentry and I feel gravity gradually coming back, it's kind of a sadness because it's such an exhilarating feeling being weightless, and then you realize that, oh my gosh, my body's going to be heavy just like it is the rest of my life, and that's the way it is. On another tack, though, these were about kind of my personal experiences, but it's been a privilege to have been able to go into space, and in taking some of the Jewish ceremonial objects. I came to realize after a while that this had a significance, not just for myself, but for Jews all over the world who heard what I was doing. And just recently, last spring, the YIVO Institute in New York City put on a show on Jews in space, and not just about me, but going back to some Jewish writers, science fiction writers, but they did have quite a few of my artifacts. This gives you kind of an idea of the sorts of things that they had. It was very popular, a very well done exhibit. You can see in the next slide is kind of how they had it set up, and then finally the Jewish ceremonial articles, which I contributed, which were put on public display. I also wanted to let the people who are watching this know, if you're interested in hearing more about what it's like going into space, I have an online course. It's completely free. We don't get any money for it, but the next slide shows basically an overview. If you go on edX, that's the MIT Harvard educational website .org, and just type in my name, you can find this. And there's a series of lectures, about 8 weeks worth of lectures on various aspects of human spaceflight. So any of you who are interested, that's a way to find out more.
Yeah, and in some way, Jeff, the reason we're here today and sharing it, because I know that in the beginning, your Jewish journey in space was very personal, and also your own community in Houston and family. But when I met you, I also realized that, and that was the case, that you didn't really share it with the world, or not enough, and that's why.
Yeah, well, the Hanukkah video, I was very pleased that had actually been made available to people all over. It had, for one reason or the other. I mean, I have a full-time job, and I never was able to pursue this on myself. But I was delighted when you took the interest in saying, we have to make this Space Torah public and share the experience, because, yeah, I've been very lucky and unique, but I think there is a responsibility to, anytime you're an explorer, you're doing something new, a part of the value is in sharing the new experience. And certainly the first Torah in space is a new experience, and I'm delighted that it can now finally be shared.
And for me, it's also, again, as an educator, it was fascinating to see the role of a community. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't just you, or always just your idea. Sometimes it was the rabbi, sometimes it's the congregant that helped to purchase some of the artifacts.
And one of our congregants actually made the little cloth cover for it, and yeah, everybody contributed something.
Yeah, it's a community effort along the way. I do want to move some of we already have several questions from the audience. I want to share them, so I'm going to read one of them, and we're going to go through them. So there's we need to adapt many things when you travel, but what happens when we go to Mars? Or if we decide not just to go and travel for 2 weeks or 6 months, but truly to live in space? Like, what do you envision when we move, maybe to live in a different planet?
Actually, in terms of sunrise and sunset, Mars is about the easiest, because a day on Mars, we call it a sol, is about 24 and a half hours. So it's not that different from the Earth. And so I imagine that if there are things you want to do according to the sun, it may take a while to adapt to a slightly longer day, but people should be able to do it. When you are on a space voyage, you can imagine, as an analogy, a long sea voyage where you look out and from day to day you see nothing but water. But a space voyage is even more monotonous than that, because when you're in the ocean, first of all, the sun rises, the sun sets. Sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's clear, sometimes it rains, sometimes it's windy. In space, nothing's going to change. I mean, you're going to look out the window and see the same stars as you saw day after day after day. So you better figure out something else to do for variety. It's going to be a psychological challenge, how to deal with that. It's hard to talk about getting bored in space, but certainly you'll be weightless. But the other thing we know about long space journeys is you can't, if you're going to be weightless for long periods of time. This wasn't a problem for me in the space shuttle, because that maximum the shuttle ever stayed up was about 2.5 weeks. You can go without exercise for 2.5 weeks, no big deal. But if you go without any exercise, and I mean literally any exercise, you're not even walking or standing up, you're just floating. It's like lying in bed for 6 months. You'll turn into a jellyfish. And so astronauts do have to spend 2 to 3 hours of really heavy duty exercise up on the space station, and they'll have to do that on the way to Mars. Further out than Mars, I think, with our current technology, is hard even to imagine. I mean, I've watched Star Trek just like everybody else, and we know about hyperdrive. And by the way, if any of you out there know how to do it, let me know. NASA would love to hear from you. But until then, the rest of the planets and certainly the stars are far, far away.
So we have another question. It says, did you feel closer to humanity in space or closer to God?
Well, people have this funny idea that somehow you look up to God. I think there's more the idea that the divine, whatever your concept of God is, that God is all over. There's sacredness, there's divinity in everything. I think that's one of the essences of Judaism, which is why there's a prayer for everything you do, because there's holiness, there's sacredness everywhere. So it's not like going into space brings you closer to God, although it's amazing how many people ask me that. No, I think what it does, if there's any change in a religious, philosophical, cultural perspective, it's in looking back at the Earth from a perspective where, I was surrounded by a vacuum. There's a real, it's something intellectually, of course, that you can't survive in space, but the visceral understanding of how hostile most of the universe is towards life really gives an extra value and sacredness to life and to our planet Earth. And I think that's a common feeling that all astronauts get is a reverence for our planet and a realization of how special the Earth is in providing life, and that we better take care of it. So a lot of astronauts come back with much more of an ecological conscience, I think, than they went up with because of that different perspective.
And you mentioned, I think, in one of our conversations, the changes in the Amazons that you saw.
Yeah, I mean, I could see over the course of my 5 flights the progressive deforestation of the Amazon. You can see how you look at hillsides as people gather firewood, and the tree line goes further and further up, and the Aral Sea drying up, and just all sorts of examples of changes to our planet Earth due to human activities, which are now visible from a cosmic perspective, which really makes that it hits you in the gut. And the Earth is taking good care of us, makes life possible. We better take good care of the Earth. It's the only one we've got right now. I mean, I think it's great, the idea of going to Mars, but it's no substitute for taking care of our own planet.
So we have 2 more questions. One of them is, do you have any advice for future Jews traveling both in general and in space?
If you're traveling in space, be safe. Actually, that's pretty good advice for any travelers. There's certain places in the world where I would not want to travel these days. And right now, it's going to be interesting because we are on the verge of opening up possibilities for many people who are not professional NASA astronauts to go into space with, private space flight, Virgin Galactic and SpaceX and Blue Origin. It will be very interesting when people start going. So, Jews in space, I suspect that there will be some private Jewish astronauts, and we'll leave it to you to bring back your travelers' tales and share your experiences with people. I don't know how a lot of non-professional astronauts will react to it. I suspect that many people looking back on the Earth will feel this same sense of awe that I and my fellow astronauts did. I hope so, and also appreciate the need to take care of our planet. And a good prayer before you leave is probably a good idea.
Yes. So Jeff, you took with you today the topic is Global Day of Jewish Learning, and we're talking about text traveling into places. So you took with you the Tfilat HaDerech that we mentioned. We took with you the mezuzah with the Shema to put on your next to your bed to remind you. You took with you our tradition of Hanukkah and all of our ancient history. You took with you the Kiddush cup that we said to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, and being free. So all of these things that are part of our heritage and in our history. And I think in some way, how did this make you feel when you took it with you when you were traveling? Because sitting, and you mentioned like sitting and this explosive device and flying, was this like a comfort, or this is?
No, I have to admit freely, when I was sitting, got into the shuttle, got into my seat, you realize you're sitting on 4.5 million pounds of high explosives. I can't honestly say that my mind was on the Mizumba. My mind was much more on, I hope the technicians did their work right, because a lot of things have to work just right in order for us to get up into space. And luckily for me, they always did. The people who are responsible for human spaceflight down at the Kennedy Space Center, Florida, Cape Canaveral, they have done an incredible job over the years. And all of us owe our lives to them.
Yeah. So the last one, I think, in some way will lead us to a conclusion of today's conversation. And another question came, but somebody asked if you have a special bracha or a blessing or hope for people here on Earth, and for us Jew living here about the future.
As a citizen of planet Earth, of course, the hope for peace and tikkun olam is extremely important, that there's so much that has to be done to improve our world. You don't have to go into space to realize that, but maybe I do have a slightly different perspective on the planet-wide things that we have to do. We can't continue to do to our planet what we're doing now and expect that there aren't going to be huge consequences. We've seen examples in human history of civilizations that have been wiped out because of ecological disasters. And this is something that, looking at the Earth from space, you get even more of a sense. So not going to affect you and me in our lifetime, but I have children, I have grandchildren, and generations to come. They need a good home to live in, and it's our responsibility. So tikkun olam, take care, improve the universe, heal ourselves. That would be my hope for humanity, that people will finally wake up and realize on a global scale, because it's not something that one country can do on its own. Everybody has to step up and realize that we're all in this together.
And this is also to end more inclusively. You chose to bring those, but I know that other astronauts brought Bible or brought other objects. So what was your experience with that? Did they share anything? Or?
Typically, we don't talk about religion when we're up in space. It's other than sort of sharing that sense of awe, looking out the window. I mean, I remember on my first flight, one of my crewmates, we were both sort of floating, looking out the window, and we were floated over these thunderstorms. And I have to say, seeing lightning from the top, it's just the most awe-inspiring light show that I had ever seen. And this was sort of the first time that we had seen it. And when it was finally over, there were no words. We just sort of turned around, looked at each other, and sighed. We knew what the other one had been experiencing, and it's one of those moments without words. And there are so many of those when we're up in space, just things that go beyond previous experience. I've been very fortunate, both as a Jew, as an American, as a human being, to have been able to do what I've done, and I'm glad now for the opportunity to share some of these experiences.
Yeah, so we have two more slides there. One of them is sharing our website. It's called spacetoraproject.com, where you can find more about the work that we're doing right now about the movie, the documentary. We're very fortunate that Jeff, when he was reading the Torah in space, a fellow astronaut actually recorded it, and we have several minutes of this actual reading that is very powerful and very moving, including the reading of some of the brachot and with some of these explanations. So to look at this original footage, it's fascinating, and we look forward to sharing it through the movie. We also you can also, we'll put a link later on for the Hanukkah video so you can see it. And please be in touch with us if you want to learn more about this experience, about how you can think about sharing it with the future generation, to really think about their personal journey wherever they go, but also their spiritual tradition and history as a people, and take it with them wherever they go. So thank you very much for joining us for Torah in Orbit, Jewish Journey in Space. And if you want to say one last thing to our audience?
What can you say other than shalom?
Shalom. Litraot.